Greetings. As part of Peace Vigil programs, we are happy to bring to you today an interview with Bill Fletcher Jr. He talks to Samir Dosani on anti racist struggles in the USA and the world. Peace Vigil brings to you tools that can help protect and promote peace. Peace Vigil. Peace needs all of us.
Today, we're joined by Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill Fletcher Jr. is the co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941, the co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Bill Fletcher Jr., it's a pleasure to speak with you today and to welcome you on behalf of Peace Vigil.
Mayor, it's great to be on. Good to reconnect.
Thank you. I wanted to start today by asking a little bit about the current situation in the US. Over the past years and even the past decades, we've seen institutionalized racism, especially within US policing, manifest itself in various and brutal ways. We've also seen a wave of protest against the violence and the extrajudicial assassinations. But the recent wave of protest feels different, at least it feels different to me. Do you think we might be at a turning point when it comes to this issue?
We're at some sort of turning point. So I think it's important for your listeners and viewers to appreciate that battles around police brutality are far from new. I mean, there's a long history to this. Anytime, I mean, after the U.S. Civil War, but I remember very well doing some research on an organization in the 1930s called the National Negro Congress, which was a sort of united front group. And I remember reading about how one of their major issues was battling police brutality. Now, being a child of the 60s and early 70s, I tended to think of the fight around police brutality as being more contemporary. So I was wrong. I mean, there's a long history to it. There's several things that are different about now and, I'd say, the period since 2014, the Ferguson uprisings. So one of the most important things is technology, that we capture a lot of things now on video in a way that was inconceivable when I was a young radical, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, just inconceivable. At best, you might get a photograph. But what's also different at this very moment is what I talk about as sort of the situation is overdetermined. You have a fusion of issues and contradictions that are making this moment explosive. The COVID-19 pandemic, the economic collapse, a series of lynchings that took place, extrajudicial killings is the more formal term, that I shouldn't say ended, but sort of crested or peaked at a particular moment with the murder of George Floyd. The role of Donald Trump inciting various forms of right-wing and extreme right-wing behavior. The environmental crisis, or environmental catastrophe. So you put all of these things together, and it's sort of like uranium achieving critical mass, resulting in an explosion. That's what's very different about this moment, because we've had fights around police brutality. We have had fights around the economy. We've had fights around the environment. But you bring all of these things together and vavoom. And then the other thing about this moment is that it is global. And that's one of the things that's very, very interesting. about what we're looking at right now, that you see these protests around the world that are ostensibly solid, or at least I shouldn't say ostensibly, at first appearance are solidarity actions around what's happening for US African Americans. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that in almost every case, there is a domestic issue in those situations, whether it is in Jerusalem and the fight against the apartheid, or whether it's in France or Britain or any number of other places where there are particularities to racist and or national oppression.
That's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the underlying, so we can talk about the particularities, but what is it that unites either these forms of oppression or the struggles against these forms of oppression, or both, in different localities?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Samir. I'll give you a couple of different answers. One is that a lot of what we're seeing globally is a rebellion against racist and national oppression. And we're also seeing a revolt against inequality. And the inequality may or may not have a racial aspect to it in each circumstance, but it's very, very real. And the inequality is not simply about income. It's inequality in housing. It's inequality when it comes to law enforcement. It's inequality when it comes to food and water. And so there's this global rebellion that's not simply protests at the WTO, with all due respect to those. It's something that's deeper. The other thing is a little bit more controversial, something I've been thinking about for a while. And you know me and controversy. There is a tendency in the US among a segment of the African American movement to fall prey to a postmodern understanding of our situation, or postmodernist. And one of the ways it plays out, Samir, is when people basically think that the oppression that US African Americans face is so unique, so different, that anyone else in the United States or internationally that analogizes their situation to ours is somehow appropriating our experience. Now, this is a very dangerous direction because, among other things, it ensures that we'll never win, because it's basically saying it's not possible for anyone to really ally with us unless they simply and slavishly support everything that we do, which we know is absurd. But it also is problematic because it fails to recognize when people talk about anti-Black racism, for example, and hold anti-Black racism up as the foundational stone to all racism. First of all, that's historically inaccurate. But second, it's that we have to appreciate that, to borrow from Steve Biko, that Black is actually the color of the racially oppressed. It's not a phenotype. Black is not fundamentally about being of African descent. It is being a historical target of global racist and national oppression centered on Europe and North America.
Yeah.
And when you
just want to interject
like
there,
that,
if I may. Just
yes.
want to refer listeners to a conversation that I had recently with Professor Rasigan Maharaj, where we talked about the fact that race theory has no leg to stand on, and that biologically we're all 99.9% identical anyway. And we talked about
Oh,
racism
absolutely.
being a form of social control to do with the inequalities that you mentioned earlier, which arises completely distinct to physiological changes that humans have evolved with due to changes, due to migration away from Africa. We're all from Africa originally.
Right. Right.
And slow changes in pigmentation so that we could better synthesize vitamin D, basically. Some of us, those of us away from the equator. So just to refer listeners to that previous conversation.
Very important. I was in a conversation yesterday. I'm executive editor of something called globalafricanworker.com. It's a relatively new web magazine. And we were having an editorial collective meeting, and someone was talking about they were just sort of furious at these medical arguments about the connection of race to COVID-19. And the person said the connection is between racism and COVID-19. And I said, that's absolutely right. I said, first of all, as you just pointed out, we are all one race, Homo sapiens, all one point of origin, Africa. And when we hear these comments about race and COVID-19, and people saying, well, Black people have more of a predisposition towards COVID-19, my question is, well, how Black do you need to be, right? I mean, I'm pretty light skinned, so does that mean I get a pass? I mean, it's like, what does that mean? And, and so what you realize is that, no, it's COVID-19 is about race and class. And racism, I should say, and class, and and that's the way we've got to look at it. So this is a long way of going back to your original point, that this moment has struck a nerve globally with people realizing that what happened, the murder of George Floyd and these extrajudicial killings, they resonate because of people's common experiences.
To me, I haven't been at this as long as you have, Phil, but I've been at this a long time. And to me, it just feels like a different moment. It feels like, looking at opinion polls in the US, it feels like something has changed. Looking at pop culture figures as far away as in India, people who are frankly, probably pretty racist and casteist in their own life, expressing solidarity with the protesters protesting the murder of George Floyd and so on. So it just seems like the mainstream has shifted in a way that I haven't seen before. Those of us who've been sort of at the margins and working on this, I mean, we've always been out in the streets, we've always been saying these things. But it feels like something is different this time. Do you get that sense as well?
I think what's going on is that we're starting to see a global counterattack against populism, to be honest, and potentially a global counterattack against neoliberalism, but a global counterattack against right-wing populism. And the thing about this counterattack is that I think it has taken the right-wing populists by surprise, including, but not limited to, Donald Trump. I think that when you see, as you mentioned, opinion polls that have demonstrated very consistent support, majority support for demonstrators, protesters here in the United States, this is different. This is absolutely different. Now, so that's the good news. Now here's where we have to be careful. I grew up as a Marxist, among other things, reading Lenin. And, I continue to think that Lenin has a lot of things of great value when we're looking at framework as well as strategy and tactics. And one of the things that he talked about was bowing to spontaneity as a danger, and that leftists worshiping the spontaneous movement and not realizing or rejecting the need for organization, for strategy, for plan, and this issue right now is that certainly in the U.S., left is weak organizationally. Progressive forces as a whole are very dispersed. And so you have this unusual moment of mass upsurge, but it won't be there forever. One never knows how long it will last, but we know it won't be there forever. And so the problem is, when there's a decline, what are we left with? Are we left with organization that can continue to prosecute the struggle, or are we left in a rout in which we are vulnerable to the attacks from the right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I think that's a good transition to take us into the next part of the discussion, which is about organizations. So you have, over your long career as an activist and with many organizations, Bill, you've been connected to both the racial justice movement, an internationalist movement, maybe Pan-Africanist internationalist movement, if you want to call it that, and also the trade union movement. So my question,
and the left,
and the left in general, yeah. So how do you see the racial justice movement learning from both the successes and the failures of the trade union movement over the years? And maybe the other way around too. What can the trade union movement learn from what the racial justice movement has been succeeding in doing over the past few weeks?
Well, they're vastly different movements. And so that's one. And what many people outside of the trade union movement specifically fail to grasp, even in what's called alt labor, alternative labor organizations, what they fail to grasp is that trade unions are very unique organizations. They are united fronts, and they contain within them, in almost every case, very diverse ideological and political views, religious views, unless they've been set up specifically on a religious basis or something else, but in most cases not. And that makes them very different from mass democratic organizations, other mass democratic organizations or NGOs, where people join them because of their stand on a whole set of issues. Now, I start there because one of the mistakes that I frequently encounter with younger activists is an impatience with the trade unions and with what is involved in changing them, and certainly moving them to the left. Because when I started my involvement in trade unions in the 1970s, it was very common for those of us on the left to pin all of the problems of the trade union movement on the small clique of leaders at the top. And it was sort of like we looked at the leaders as the equivalent of seaweed floating on the ocean, disconnected from anything. And that all you needed was a net to grab the seaweed and skim it off the ocean, and then everything would be fine, right? Well, it turned out that things were a bit more complicated than that, and that the seaweed was more like sargasso weed, that it was very complicated, very interconnected, and actually had roots. And in our case, in the trade union movement, it would have roots within a segment of the base. And so many activists have failed to appreciate the implications of that. So that's one thing I would say that's really important. I think that the racial justice movement is not really a movement. It's more of a moment. It's more of a configuration. There are a variety of different racial justice forces. Now, one of the things that I would say, I'm not sure it's a lesson for the racial justice movement to learn from the trade union movement, but it's a very important lesson for the movement to learn historically, is that the struggle against racism in the United States and globally is not a binary struggle. It's not black versus white. And I don't mean that in moralistic terms. I mean that in very practical, historical terms. And I'll give you an example of something that comes up. One thing I mentioned before about the fixation on anti-black racism in the absence of an appreciation of other forms of racism. There's a term, an acronym, that has started to emerge in the United States, BIPOC, BIPOC, and that's for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And it's being raised by some people to replace the term people of color. And it's theoretically being raised to highlight that sort of the original sin of the United States was the oppression of people of African descent and the indigenous. The problem is that the term completely erases colonial peoples, direct colonial peoples of the United States, specifically Puerto Ricans and Chicanos, Mexican Americans. And so it's really important when we're building a movement around racial justice that we appreciate that there are different experiences with racism, all of which have certain things in common, but all of which have distinct components. Anti-Asian racism is very real in the United States, but the anti-Asian racism that's faced by pre-1965 Chinese and Japanese is very different than post-1965 Asian immigrants. And then among Asian immigrants, there's vast differences between Filipinos and Koreans, for example. But so you have to look at the particularities while at the same time understanding commonalities. And this is something that I don't think is fully appreciated. So I don't think that those are things so much that those movements have to learn from one another, but more that those are things that those movements have to learn. Because in the absence of that, they will be unable to construct a strategy to win. We'll constantly be on the defensive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to poke into a little bit because I've been really focusing on this question about colonialism and the sort of the root principles, I call them, of colonialism, which are about sort of divide and rule, but in order to steal. And so the idea of, the divide and rule part of it was always you favor one group over another. You're of course, the master over in Europe is going to take most of the wealth. But in order to do that, you need to co-opt a certain element of the people who you're trying to conquer, right? And so even within colonial societies, like here in South Africa, I am studying with a group of indigenous people called the Khoisan. That term is racialized, but we don't have to get into it. But they were actually used, some of them were used to track, people who were enslaved, people who were escaping, Bantu people, so people who had migrated from other parts of Africa long before white folks came. But the white folks used the sort of indigenous people and against the people who they were enslaving. So it's complicated, right? And yes. Often these are not, but it's complicated, but there are principles. I think there are principles that once we understand them, we can talk more about what decolonization would mean. And maybe that's a good point to ask you. Is there, in Africa, we talk a lot about decolonization and what it means. I have my own sort of interpretation of what the word should mean. But has that been talked about in the U.S. and what does it mean to you?
It's been talked about over the years, sometimes by analogy and sometimes rhetorically. Decolonization, I borrow from Amilcar Cabral. It means people returning to their own history, fundamentally, and recognizing we have that the victims of colonialism were taken out of their own history, out of their trajectory, and put into someone else's. And so decolonization is about restoring our path. It's about self-determination. It is about fiercely and defiantly destroying racism and racist oppression. There's a term from the South African movement that is not very well understood in the United States and has actually led to some complications. The notion of non-racial. And I remember when I was getting more deeply involved in the anti-apartheid movement and learning and hearing that terminology, non-racial. And I didn't really get it because the frame of reference I had was both black and white, literally and figuratively, but also sort of multiracial. And those are the terms that we would use in the United States. And as I got to know the South African movement in more depth, I understood, I came to appreciate that non-racial was not racial blindness, but was fierce anti-racism. And and there's a peculiar story that relates to the late Manning Marable's biography of Malcolm X, where at the end of the book, there was some terminological confusion that I attribute to the editor that led to some misunderstandings in terms of Marable's intent. Because non-racial, if you're going to say non-racial in the United States, it means anti-racism. And so anti-colonial is that. It's anti-racial hierarchies as well. So anti-colonialism is not simply the removal of the external colonizer. I mean, you think about Algeria. I have a soft spot for Algeria ever since reading Frantz Fanon, and the impact and significance of the Algerian Revolution for U.S. African Americans. But what many of us didn't appreciate was the complexity of the situation in Algeria. It wasn't just the Algerian people against the French, but there were contradictions between the Arabs and the so-called Berbers. And there was these racial hierarchies that had been constructed, some of which were legacies of the Arab invasion in North Africa, and some of which were the direct result of French colonialism. And so decolonization is coming to grips with history and deconstructing said hierarchies, which means that understanding history becomes critically important, which is a lot of what I spend my time on here. Really helping people to develop a framework, an historically based framework that understands race as fundamentally a post-1492 construction associated with the development of capitalism.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Bill, and very much in line with what we've been saying in other discussions. With that, I think we can shift gears a little bit. So you've mentioned now South Africa and a little bit about some of the conversations you were having as an ally of the movement against apartheid. And we've talked about your role as in sort of internationalist spaces, which I should say, the US, or maybe this is a good place to start, the US movements, the US left in general, is not really considered by movements elsewhere to have much of an internationalist wing. Do you think that's an accurate description? And why do you think that may be the case if it is?
When you live in Rome, why should you be concerned with the rest of the empire? I mean, that's my answer. And that's the thinking of many people in the United States, that why do I need to learn another language? I live in the United States. Why do I need to think about the ramifications of what the US does? I mean, Samir, it's very, very accurate. And unfortunately, too many people in the United States hide behind ignorance when it comes to global issues, and particularly the role of the U.S. They hide behind ignorance, and it's one thing to not know about something. It's another thing to make a point of not knowing about something. And we in the United States often make a point of both opposing history as well as not knowing things.
Yeah. So I expect that, I mean, just full disclosure, I also grew up in the US, so I have my own opinion on this. But, one might expect that from the right wing, and one would expect that from the right wing almost anywhere. But one sees it also in the left wing in the US, or at least
yes,
certainly in the center left, certainly in the Democratic Party, yeah. But even in forces to the left of the Democratic Party, one sees it almost everywhere. So so if you can talk a little bit more about why that may be the case and why you didn't fall into that trap would also be interesting.
Second question is interesting, why I didn't fall in. But starting with the first, I think it goes back to what I was saying about living in Rome, that that there is. Let me give you an analogy. I went to college at Harvard. Harvard, being one of the Ivy League schools, is a place to help to train the global ruling class. And that doesn't mean that everyone that goes there has that intention. I certainly had no intention. I went there as a radical and left even more radical. But the environment promotes a certain kind of arrogance, irrespective of intent of the participant in that environment. The environment leads you to believe that there is something very special about you. And when I left Harvard, I ultimately ended up in a shipyard as a welder because I wanted to get involved in the labor movement. And it was a very humbling experience. Nobody knew I had gone to Harvard. And they wouldn't have hired me if they did. And I had to learn about the world, but it was a very different setting. I think, unfortunately, in the United States, when you live in a situation where basically we are told day in and day out that we are sort of the premier nation state, it can affect even left-wing movements. And it can even affect racialized populations. I'll give you an example. number of years ago, I went to visit Brazil a couple of times, and I was speaking with an Afro-Brazilian who was both a trade unionist as well as involved in the Black consciousness movement there. And she told me this story about a delegation of US African American trade unionists that went to visit Brazil, and they were talking with Afro-Brazilians, and they were telling the Afro-Brazilians how to fight white supremacy. And the Afro-Brazilians were very polite, and they were very perplexed why U.S. African Americans thought they could come to Brazil and tell the Afro-Brazilians how to fight white supremacy. But the answer was because that's the construct in which we've been developed, that kind of arrogance, even among the oppressed. So you see this play out in a number of different ways, in terms of the way organizations operate, in terms of thinking about strategy largely in domestic terms, not about the ramifications of US policy. And sometimes when we're internationalists, it can be very condescending, very moralistic, as opposed to so it's all of those factors, Samir, that combine that can lead to a certain kind of narrowness that I often associate with us. When I first visited South Africa, I was warned, this was in 1999, I was warned that there was of US African Americans because during the anti-apartheid struggle, there had been an assumption that our engagement in the anti-apartheid movement was out of solidarity, which it largely was. But after liberation, there were US African Americans that went to South Africa, allegedly to help, but basically to enrich themselves. And so it's like, well, how can people do that? Well, in part because it's not simply about, well, all people can be greedy, but there's a way in which our consciousness and actions definitely are shaped by our environment and the environment that raised us. And while the overwhelming part of the US African American movement that was supporting the anti-apartheid struggle would not be avaricious, nevertheless, that was a factor.
This is so interesting. And tell us a little bit about why and how you managed to avoid that trap. How did you become interested in genuine solidarity as opposed to, sort of what might be described as a very narrow US focus, and if there's a little bit of solidarity that comes out of that, well, that's fine.
So I would say I haven't avoided it. I've struggled around it. And I think it is a perpetual struggle. I was fortunate that I was raised in a family that was very interested in world affairs. A very progressive family, had all kinds of viewpoints, but very progressive, overwhelmingly, on both sides, my mother and father's. And so discussing international affairs was something that I did in elementary school. I think the critical moment was watching developments, even at a very early age of 13, 14, developments in the African American movement where people were paying more attention to international issues. And then certainly when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it changed my life. And it changed in so many ways. Everything from, always wear a watch. Because Malcolm X said that he was always impatient with people that didn't wear watches because they didn't understand that we don't have endless time. To the importance of the international issues and Black internationalism, not just Pan-African, but Black internationalism. And then the influence of the Black Panther Party, which was very Black internationalist. And it was from the Black Panther Party learning about struggles like in Ireland, the Western Sahara, obviously Vietnam, and any number of other places. So I sort of was drawn into a segment of the movement that was internationalist. But it's a constant struggle, Samir, because, for example, I'm not good with languages. Now, I can attribute that, and I think it's sincere in saying that there's some people that are better with languages than others, and I'm not good at learning languages. That said, I was successfully able to avoid really learning Spanish and French when I should have. I should have undertaken a more serious effort to do that. And so that's what I mean. It's uneven. It's a constant battle. But when you live in the United States, it's very easy to say, well, you know, I should learn Spanish, but you know, at the end of the day, I don't really need it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny, Bill, because I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum. I speak 9 or 10 languages, but as a consequence, people just assume I work for the CIA, by the way. They don't assume that I'm being a good internationalist leftist.
Listen, well, I tell you, man, even not speaking multiple languages, one of the things that I had to deal with when I first started visiting the continent was there, and when I went to Latin America, there was suspicion, in part because I worked for the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO, as the main U.S. labor federation, had a very bad history in international affairs. So even in the absence of speaking languages, there was suspicion. I mean, I remember I went to Brazil. My second trip to Brazil, I went to a place called Recife in the northeast, and large, very Afro-Brazilian. And there was a trade union school that was run by these Afro-Brazilian women. And when I got there, they were very polite, but they kept their distance. And, you know, I didn't know. So I was polite in return. A couple of days later, when we left, we were all crying, right? And it's like they were sorry we were going. And they hugged me and they said, Bill, when you came here, we didn't know who you were. And I understood completely what they meant. They didn't mean who with a capital W. They meant they didn't know whether I was CIA. And so it was like, you know, convincing people that I was the real deal. And I can understand that from a number of different vantage points. But I wish I could speak 9 languages.
No, it's real. And I think the distrust that we face, by the way, I've been to that school in Recife. It's a beautiful place. I think the suspicion that we face as, you know, US activists who are trying to be internationalists is justified, frankly. And I think it's just something we gotta put up with.
Yeah.
So can we shift a little bit now? Because as we're having this conversation, it's entirely possible that Israel will be annexing parts of the West Bank. And when we talk about the struggle against racism, colonization, imperialism, and so on. I think the Palestine-Israel struggle, you know, is in the place that, say, the South African struggle was, you know, in the 80s, when you were very active in that struggle in the US. So I know you're very active in the struggle. I know you sit on the board of some organizations that are doing good work. Tell us a little bit about some of the parallels you see between, you know, that struggle against colonialism and earlier ones, or is it more unique than parallel?
It's both. So let's start with the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. The anti-apartheid movement, there's a lot of myths. And when I took over Trans-Africa Forum in 2002, I was immediately confronted with many of the myths. Those myths included a false timeline for how long the struggle had been, both in South Africa as well as in the United States around apartheid. So what a lot of people failed to appreciate was that the anti-apartheid struggle was a component of an anti-colonial struggle. It wasn't like pre-1948, everything was hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden something happened in 1948 and it all went to hell. There was a settler colony. There was settler colonialism that existed. In 1948, it took a particular form. So one is that this is a struggle that's gone back to the 19th century. The second thing is that the particular anti-apartheid struggle begins in 1948. And in the United States, there were forces that were trying to raise the anti-apartheid struggle, beginning almost immediately, that were suppressed in the context of the Cold War. Because what the objectives of Britain and the United States with the Cold War revolved around was suppressing domestic dissident movements that were by the left in their respective countries and empires, and constraining the Soviet Union and also China after 1949. And part of that was targeting national liberation struggles. And the U.S. had this very strange relationship where it sometimes supported anti-colonial movements, but not national liberation struggles. So supporting the end of colonialism so that those countries could become open to U.S. penetration, but not support real national liberation. All right. So the anti-apartheid movement in the United States faced immediate repression by Cold Warriors. In the 1950s, you start to see the emergence of a new tendency that was less left-wing, more dominated by liberals and social democrats, but nevertheless raising the torch around apartheid. And in the 1960s, the developing, energized Black freedom movement connects internationally and starts to re-raise the issue of apartheid and colonialism. Now, one of the problems, Samir, is this: an impact of the Cold War on our movement here was to distort the framework with which we looked at anti-colonial struggles. And for African Americans, what it often meant was looking at struggles in the global South through a racial lens, i.e., white people are the problem, and an anti-colonial struggle is basically aimed at getting the majority who are of color mobilized against the European or North American, and that once that segment, once the European is removed, then we're off to the land of milk and honey. And this framework that narrowed things to simplistic racial terms did not prepare us for post-1994. It did not prepare us for understanding the complexities and contradictions within the former colonial world. That's a discussion we can get to maybe in a minute. Now, the anti-apartheid struggle had at its core an African-American constituency. There was no Africana constituency in the United States to speak of. There were pro-apartheid forces in the United States establishment. Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party, for example, pro the apartheid leadership, pro-Africana. But that's different than having mass constituency in the United States that was opposing the anti-apartheid movement. That is one of the big distinctions when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Because in the United States, you have a large segment of the Jewish population that is Zionist or pro-Zionist and serves as base, along with a large Christian Zionist mass base that allies with segments of the US ruling class. So those distinctions become very, very important. The other thing that is important in understanding the United States' role, I would argue, particularly in Southern Africa and in Palestine, is the fact that the U.S. was a settler state. The U.S. was constructed on a basis of settler colonialism. And so when the mainstream U.S. looks at Israel, it has great difficulty challenging Israel because Israel has done essentially what the United States did when it expanded westward and when it removed the indigenous from their land, when it seized northern Mexico, when it annexed northern Mexico in 1848. And so this becomes a problem in terms of, well, the Israelis are doing what we, white America did. How can we object? Which was also a problem in some respects when it came to South Africa. But again, the difference was that there was a large African-American constituency here that was opposing apartheid. And we don't have the same thing when it comes to Israel and Palestine, even though we have a growing constituency here that supports Palestinian demands for justice.
Yeah. I mean, just my sense is that especially with Netanyahu being sort of I don't know if you want to call him a Trump equivalent, but he is kind of a Trump equivalent in a lot of ways.
Yes.
My sense is that it could be a moment for some paradigm shift. I'm not so sure within what is historically Palestine. I'm not sure within that part, but on the U.S. side, it seems like there could be a moment of just rejection of that kind of leadership, and even some sort of more centrist Zionist forces sort of saying, enough is enough. This is going too far. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into the moment, but it seems like there could be some kind of at least things that weren't on the table 5 years ago or would never even have been possible to be on the table, like greatly reducing aid to Israel and so on. It seems to me that these things could be on the table in the near future. Or am I jumping to conclusions
Oh,
here?
I think great. I think we've been seeing a trend over the last several years of growing support for Palestinian justice, and Netanyahu's rabid aggressiveness has become a real source of embarrassment within the liberal Zionist community. I mean, for years, you've had people asserting that a two-state solution was the way that things had to happen. That would be the solution. And with each year, it became apparent that a two-state solution was becoming less and less feasible. I went to Israel and Palestine. I've gone there twice, but I was there in January 2014. And I'll tell you that what struck me more than anything was what felt to be, and I wrote about it when I came back, this slow-moving annexation. I looked at these settler communities, and Samir, they looked like Southern Californian suburbs, and always on hills, and these very, very nice communities sitting in the middle of Palestinian territory. And I mean, my first thought and my last thought in leaving there was, these Israelis aren't giving this up. They're not giving this up. They're not gonna close up and say we're giving this up any more than the United States is going to voluntarily give up New Mexico and say, yeah, no, you're right. In 1848, we ripped you off and we're going to give this back to Mexico. It's not happening unless there's force. Or unless what we're talking about is some sort of binational one-state solution.
It's interesting you say that, because it's still a point of contention among, especially in the US. But I think just de facto, that's kind of what's happened, right? And we're at a point where it has to be Israel de facto controls all of this land. So give everyone a vote and let it be, let that be the next step of this struggle. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you agree with the folks who have been saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that there is a two-state solution anymore. But I worry that that growing forces in Israel are going to look for a U.S. solution. And the U.S. solution is the expulsion of the Palestinians. Right. And when I say a U.S. solution, I mean what the U.S. did to the indigenous, of basically pushing them further and further off the land, reservations, pushing the Mexicans off their land, ripping them off in terms of the land that had been granted them, and completely ghettoizing or forcing the Palestinians into a situation where they feel that there's no solution but to retreat into Jordan.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, man. That's ethnic cleansing, I believe, is the technical term for that one.
That's right. That's exactly what it is. That's what we've been seeing. And I think that the right wing within Israel, which has become more and more part of a national consensus, is quite comfortable with the racial ethnicity, because if you look at what inspired in 1949. There was ethnic cleansing of what was at that point called the Palestine Mandate. So is no vast canyon between pre-1967 Israel and we are today.
Yeah, yeah. Bill, it's been a pleasure. I want to sort of move us to a close here, but this is kind of a heavy note to be closing on. So maybe we can think back to, there is this moment in the U.S. There is this opportunity. There is this excitement. There is, you mentioned the confluence of factors. You have the COVID crisis. You have the economic crisis. You have just built up frustrations of people who've been getting by paycheck to paycheck, who may not be able to do that anymore. If you were to be able to have the ear of all the young organizers today, what is some of the advice you could give them based on, we've seen waves of this before. You and I were there. I remember Seattle being a moment when, things really felt like something would change. You may remember the riots that accompanied the beating of Rodney King as a similar moment in the 90s. So we've seen these kind of moments come and go. What would you say so that, the going part is the hard part. What can we offer? What advice can we offer the younger generation so that they can learn from our mistakes?
I would say that the advice that I would offer includes this. We need to build 2 levels of organization. We need a solid left that is anti-capitalist, is internationalist, that understands that every step that we take, the ultimate aim is social transformation. And you need that kind of core, the sort of conscience of the movement. The second thing you need is you need varying levels of broader fronts that bring different forces together. One of the things that I have been pushing every opportunity I get is the need for a people's anti-repression coalition that we need right now to bring together organizations and activists, young and older, that are organized around a set of very basic demands. No deployment of troops in our communities. The rethinking, restructuring, reallocation of resources, and demilitarizing of law enforcement. Justice for those who have been lynched. Opposition to austerity. And consistent democracy, including but not limited to full voting rights and no voter suppression. And I think those are the basic demands of a broad people's anti-repression coalition. And I think that as such, we have to really guard against sectarianism. I saw recently a statement of support for the movement for Black lives by Latinos and Latinas. And there were elements within the movement for Black lives that when they saw the statements, in essence, thank you very much, but this doesn't quite align with our demands. So can you do something to better align yourself with our demands? I had a discussion with a comrade and I said, hey, bro, that's not exactly what you say to allies. You know, it usually starts with, thank you very much. We really appreciate the support and it really means a lot to us. And then if you want to negotiate more, but you negotiate more by accepting that this is what has been offered by people who don't have to offer you a damn thing. And so we've got to get away from this sort of sectarian self-righteousness. You know, when you're, there's an old saying, this people you meet when you're going, people you when you're going down. And sometimes when you're in a movement that's on the rise, it's easy to believe that you are what we cats me at. And you can forget that you may not be always cresting. You know, there may be some moments when things are going to turn. And so I would say that being aware of sectarianism, and the other thing that I would caution around is to be wary of provocateurs. In the United States, as you know, there was a program that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had in the 1950s and 1960s called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, in which agents were deployed to disrupt all kinds of movements, to disrupt the US Communist Party, to disrupt the African American movement, Latinas, Native Americans, etc., the peace movement. And it's really important when a movement is vibrant, or even when it's not, to be very careful and keep your eye out for provocateurs. And the provocateurs frequently are those that advocate the most extreme tactics and challenge people that if they're truly radical, if they're truly revolutionary, that they will engage in those kind of activities. The provocateurs are frequently the ones that spread very dangerous rumors. They are frequently the ones that are, inciting differences as opposed to mediating differences. Now, this doesn't mean that every person that advocates the most extreme position is a provocateur. It doesn't mean that every person that spreads a rumor is a provocateur. But it means that there's certain behaviors that have to be carefully monitored because they will bring a movement down. So those would be a few pieces of advice that I would offer.
Yeah, I have a funny story. Back in my younger days as a movement, as an activist, I wasn't even a leader at that point. There was some guy who was, we had a blockade of something. The building was being blockaded, and this guy said, let's some of us young boys, let's go and let's rush the cops. And so we were like, okay, fine, let's go rush the cops. So we all line up. There are like 10 of us. And when, we start running, like 1, 2, 3, let's go. And when we're about, 20 yards away from the cops, or maybe 10 yards away from the cops, someone yells, now. And all of us stop except for the guy whose idea it was, who keeps on going. And, we see him 5 minutes later having a donut and a cigarette with his friends and the police. So yeah, they're everywhere. But if you use a little bit of intelligence, you can spot them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's plenty of examples of that. And there's still people incarcerated today who were active in the 60s and 70s that were set up by agents. were encouraged to engage in various activities. There was a biography of a former Panther named Eddie Jamal Joseph, who's about my age, maybe a year older, who was incarcerated quite young. And I was reading his memoir, and I said to my daughter, I said, this could have been me. I was close to the Panthers. I was not a member, but I was very close. And there were people that were encouraging very dangerous activity and essentially helped you if you were reluctant. And in his case, the person that turned him in was a leader who was advocating extreme activity, turned out to be an agent.
Yeah, so some of my first work, Bill, was doing political prisoner solidarity. And so I heard some of these stories from, I don't know if you remember the New York Three, but one of them, the one who died in the 90s, Noah Washington, was a good friend of mine. I used to visit him quite often in jail in upstate New York. It was quite shocking. It wasn't so shocking, the oppression. I mean, I had read the COINTELPRO papers by then. What was shocking was how little it was known and talked about, even within the U.S. left. I thought that was a problem.
Oh, yeah, it continues to be.
So just to sum up what you said at the end there, so what I heard was it would be great at this moment in time if all of us from our different movements could come together across a platform that would be sort of, this is the minimum of what we're asking for a platform. The second thing I heard was we all need to have some humility when we're interacting with one another, and be willing to accept solidarity when it is genuine solidarity. We need to avoid the kind of sectarianism that has destroyed previous generations of movements. And we need to look out for cops, basically, for people who say they're our allies, but really not. And sometimes those are the people who are, they're sounding the most pure and the most radical, but they don't really have any strategy. So I think talking about strategy,
you need a conscious left. And you need a conscious left. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if in the absence of a conscious left, a socialist left, the problem is always that these efforts will sputter.
On that note, Bill, I'd like to thank you very much. This has really been a great conversation. I hope we can do it again sometime soon. But thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
You were listening to a Peace Vigil interview with Bill Fletcher Jr., where he talked to Sameer Dosani about anti-racist struggles in the USA and the world. For more Peace Vigil interviews and other programs, you can see on this channel the lists that are available. Peace Vigil provides tools that help protect and promote peace. Peace Vigil. Peace needs all of us.